In the letters of John Newton, one of the topics that he touches on that is extremely helpful for us is the topic of sin that continues to exist in the life of a follower of Jesus. When we become a follower of Jesus, our guilt is removed because of the work that Jesus did for us on the cross. And yet, in our lives, as we live in this world, we continue to struggle against the power of sin. Sometimes sins that just don't seem to go away. We don't like it, but they're there. Newton has a helpful observation. He says, since the Lord hates and abhors sin and teaches his people whom he loves to hate it likewise, it might seem desirable that at the same time that they are delivered from the guilt and the reigning power of sin, they should likewise be perfectly freed from the defilement of indwelling sin. In other words, Newton's saying, it might seem to us that because God hates sin and because he teaches us to hate sin too, he might have chosen to deliver us from any indwelling sin in our lives the same way he's already delivered us from the guilt of sin. But, Newton says, his wisdom has appointed otherwise. What? You mean God continues to allow us to sin? Well, we have to conclude that he would, because God certainly has the power to eliminate it completely from our lives, and yet, for some reason, chooses to allow us, even though the guilt is still ours, to persist in things that are not ultimately according to his revealed will. Why, you might say? Well, Newton goes through all the same sort of caveats that Paul does in Romans, saying that we shouldn't just sin presuming upon the grace of God so that grace would abound. Of course not. But Newton does say that God would not suffer sin to remain in us if he did not purpose to overrule it for the fuller manifestation of the glory of his grace and wisdom, and for the making of his salvation more precious to their souls. In other words, we can't always understand why God would allow sin to continue in our lives, even as we struggle against it as followers of Jesus. But one thing we can know, perhaps, is that God does have a purpose in it. And one of those purposes is for us to understand a fuller manifestation of his glory and his grace and his wisdom, and thus make our salvation even more precious to our souls. It reminds me of something that I heard the late pastor from the Philadelphia area, Jack Miller, describe. He says, when we first become a Christian, we realize a little bit of our sin. And as a result, the gap between our sin and God's holiness is relatively small. And so therefore, the cross that bridges that gap between our sin and God's holiness is relatively small. The longer we go in our Christian life, however, the more we realize the depth of our sin. And therefore, the greater our appreciation for the cross that bridges the gap between us and God's holiness. It's only a small glimpse, and we're continually reminded to fight against the power of evil in our lives. But God is at work, and we can have confidence in that. Wherever our circumstances, the words of Psalm 77, verse 1, should encourage us to go to God where we are. I cry aloud to God, aloud to God, and he will hear me. Have a great day.